Okay, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, for the second episode of the podcast session organized by Food for All Kadamandiya Food Bank, Sri Lanka. And we appreciate your participation in the very first session, episode number 1 of the Kadamandiya Food Bank podcast series under the theme of Ask from the Experts. And the first episode was about to become a leader. And for the today's episode, we have selected another topic. Ladies and gentlemen, as I explained in the previous session, in the episode number 1, we are exploring the aspects related to the Sustainable Development Goal number 2, Zero Hunger, and the Sustainable Development Goal number 12, Responsible Consumption and Production. In the journey of exploring the aspects related to these two goals, the topic that we selected today is volunteering and food banking services. We were thinking about a person to be selected as the resource person for the session. So we selected one of the greatest humble personalities for the today's session, episode number 2 of the Ask from the Experts podcast series by Food for All Kadamandiya Food Bank. Ladies and gentlemen, before starting the session, I believe it's my responsibility to give a little introduction about the resource person for the today's session. And he is, in the designation, he is the Director of Field Services for Global FoodBanking Network, and his career is tightly bound with food banks and community service. And not only that, with more than 30 years of experience in the field, he travels extensively and manages food bank development projects, member support, and training activities as well. And previously, he has been the Executive Director of the Greater Petersburg Community Food Bank, and not only that, the Vice President of Member Support for Feeding America. And he has served as the Chair of Board of Directors of National Voluntary Organization Active in Disaster as well. And as another point, his activities with Feeding America aided countries like Argentina and Israel as well. And his work with the organization helped these countries develop and maintain successful food banks in vulnerable communities as well. And not only that, with his experiences, with his load of experiences and career history, he has helped establish Global FoodBanking Network through the expansion of food banking network internationally. His work with Bob Forney, Bill Rudnick, and others led to launch of Global FoodBanking Network in the month of July in the year of 2006. And the organization he helped create continues to benefit hungry communities all over the world. Ladies and gentlemen, the resource person for the episode number 2 of the podcast series by Kadamandiya Food Bank is none other than Mr. Chris Rebstock, the Director of Field Services for the Global Food Banking Network. Dear sir, we welcome you to the podcast session by Food for All Kadamandiya Food Bank podcast session. And it's a great honor for us to have you here with us today.
Thank you. It's my pleasure and an honor to be asked to join in the podcast series.
Okay, sir. Before jumping onto the series of questions related to the topic of the today's topic of the episode number 2, volunteering and food banking services, I believe the audience is curious to know about your career beyond the things that I mentioned in the introduction. So we'd love to know something about your career.
Sure. Well, as you mentioned, I've been a food banker for many years. I started as a volunteer, actually, with a newly created food bank in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which is in the northeast part of the United States. At the time, I worked for an organization that provided a variety of programs for hungry people in the southwest counties of the state of Pennsylvania around Pittsburgh. And that organization learned about the concept of food banking, which was quite young at the time. The first food bank was founded in 1967 in Phoenix, Arizona, down in the southwest of the country. And by 1980, the organization I worked for, Hunger Action Coalition, learned about the concept and decided to start a food bank in Pittsburgh. And I was fascinated with the concept of food banking, and I asked my supervisor if I could be part of the team that researched the food bank and developed the plan to establish the food bank in the community. And he allowed me to do that. And so I learned a lot in the planning process about how food banks work and what the various inputs and requirements are for their operations. And once the food bank was established, I was appointed to the board of directors. And for about a year and a half or close to 2 years, I served on the board, and in my free time, I volunteered as a driver to pick up donations from grocery stores. And I volunteered in the warehouse to sort the food and prepare it for distribution to the agencies that we supplied the food to. And after a couple of years, the person that was running the food bank, for personal reasons, needed to resign. He was actually moving out of the city. And so I resigned from the board of directors and became the executive director of the food bank. And that was a fabulous learning experience. And most important, learning how broad-based the organization's needs were for volunteer support. We had volunteers working in every aspect of the organization, and if we didn't have those volunteers, we would not have been able to function. So I worked at that food bank for about 5 years, and then moved on to Feeding America, and then eventually, as you indicated, in 2006, the food bank networks in Canada, Mexico, and Argentina joined Feeding America to create the Global FoodBanking Network. And I left Feeding America with Bob Forney, and he and I were the first 2 employees of the Global FoodBanking Network.
Okay, so it's really inspiring. As a budding food bank in Sri Lanka, it's like really you are paving us the path. Actually, I feel like something like that. Okay, today's topic, as I mentioned previously, it is really about volunteering and food banking services. So the first question that I would like to raise is, as a gigantic character in the Global Food Banking Network, in accordance yourself, what does it mean by volunteering? I believe with the load of experiences that you have, I believe there should be something beyond what we usually know.
Oh. Volunteers, I believe, are the lifeblood of food banks. There's no food bank anywhere that can afford to hire all the staff that it needs to deliver effective community service. And I mean that not just for small developing food banks like your own, but even for very large, sophisticated, well-established food banks. The need for volunteer services grows as the organization grows, of course, right? And even at a food bank like the one here in Chicago, which is one of the biggest food banks in the United States, they probably have about 150 or 160 full-time employees, but they use tens of thousands of volunteers a year. And those tens of thousands of volunteers provide enough hours of service that it would probably make up another 50 or 60 full-time employees if you combined all those hours together. And so even the very large, well-developed food banks are dependent on volunteers in order to deliver the services that they provide to the community. And volunteers tend to be, in my experience, very special people. They're not motivated by a paycheck. They're not motivated by the economic benefit that they get from their service to the community. They're motivated by empathy and by the desire to use their skill and their time to improve the communities in which they live. that there's just no way to operate a food bank and to be effective and efficient in the community without a committed core of volunteers to assist in doing that.
Okay, thank you, sir. And can you briefly explain how did you grow as a leader? And what are the key milestones of your journey? And I believe, I expect actually some of the challenges that you face in your journey.
Well, we've already talked about my career progression from the local food bank to the national food bank network, and now to the global network. The milestones in that process tended to be built around my progression from one point to the next point. Really was dependent on how much I learned in each role that I ended up having. You know, as a board member and volunteer at the food bank, then as the director of the food bank, then moving to the national network and having the opportunity to learn how, from the national office, to deliver service to the local food banks in the Feeding America system. There were lots of opportunities to learn different aspects of compliance management and distribution logistics and personnel and human resources and volunteer management and all the different components that go together to making a food bank effective. There were lots of challenges along the way. You know, when I was a director of the food bank, one of the biggest challenges was finding sustainable sources of revenue to be able to continue to operate. And as we developed new programs and expanded those programs in the community, finding the right partners to provide the resource base that would allow for the programs to be sustainable for the long term. Again, as a reminder, that was in the relatively early days of food banking, and so there wasn't a lot of trust of food banks by the food industry and by government authorities and other important stakeholders. And so one of the big challenges was trying to establish ourselves and build our policies and our protocols in such a way that would engender trust from those stakeholders in order to garner their support. And we struggled with that for a number of years and finally overcame it by getting a core of professionals from within the food industry who were interested in what we were doing and who were working in areas within the food industry that directly related to the needs of the food bank. So I'm talking about quality control managers who were the ones who were responsible for food safety administration, right, in their own businesses. And we got them to come and teach us how to build our warehouse operations and our transportation operations in such a way that protected the integrity of the food so that we were making sure nobody was going to get sick by taking food from the food bank, consuming food from the food bank. And once we did that, once we reached out to the stakeholders and pulled them in to the overall policy development and direction of our operations, that trust level started to grow. And as our trust in the private sector grew, then it was much easier to get the government, the relevant government organizations to build trust with us as well. And today, for example, in the United States, there's a very, very strong partnership between the food banking system and various aspects of the federal government, and a lot of collaborative work by both parties. So it's those kinds of challenges in taking a concept, adapting the concept to the circumstances of your community, of your society, and then focusing on building the relationship that you have to build with those key stakeholders in order to establish credibility and be recognized for the integrity that you hold in the community.
Okay. And Mr. Chris Rebstock, actually, my next question is about it's about volunteering. In accordance your experience, this load of experiences, as you believe, to which extent volunteering is important for this food bank service?
Well, as I mentioned, I don't think any food bank can be fully effective in developing its potential in the community without a core of volunteers. Developing, engaging, and retaining a core of dedicated volunteers who are as committed to the vision and the mission of the food bank as are the paid employees. In many food banks, volunteers hold quite important roles, even in the management and the administration and operations of the food bank. And it's their work in helping to address the challenges that I talked about before, and that partnership development with the private sector and with the public sector that leads to the food bank's credibility in the community. So I think volunteers are absolutely critical at all levels in the organization, from the handling of the food and the management of the warehouse, through the partnership development, and even in support of the overall management, and certainly the governance. The board of directors are volunteers, and they're the ones who are responsible for setting strategic direction and overseeing their fiduciary responsibilities and commitment to the community and to the government for the transparent and effective administration of the food bank operations. So they're required through the whole spectrum of administration and operation.
Okay, so thank you. And my next question, it's about actually youth. Today our topic is volunteering and food banking services. Actually, as the Kadamandiya Food Bank, Food for All Kadamandiya Food Bank, actually we are about to launch this volunteering program. So we are also curious about this point because in many countries, we have seen the youth is the portion that is engaged in food banking networks in many cases. So in your point of view, how do you define the significance of volunteering to youth in terms of food banking perspective?
I think that volunteering provides a couple of different opportunities for any individual that volunteers, but especially for the youth. The first is it provides an opportunity for them to deploy their skills and their empathy for the vulnerable populations in their community. It gives them an outlet to be able to act on that empathy and to use their skills to the betterment of the community. But it also provides a training and an educational opportunity. The nature of food bank operations is very broad, and food banks, for all practical purposes, are exactly the same as commercial food distributors, right? They're acquiring food. They're not buying it as a food distributor would be. They're getting it donated. They're handling that food and managing logistics around handling it. And then they're getting it out to customers, right? The commercial food distributor is selling it to his customers. The food bank is donating it to its beneficiary institutions. But the only real difference between a commercial food distributor and a food bank is cause, its purpose, right? The commercial food distributor exists to build economic benefit for its owners or its stakeholders, its shareholders. The food bank does the same work, but does it not for profit, does it not for the economic benefit of owners, but for the nutritional and social inclusion needs of its population. So this provides a great opportunity for young volunteers to learn various aspects of business management and to build within themselves personal commitment to a cause and learn how to deploy that that personal commitment in the context of a real business organization, a real business experience. So they can get informal education about business administration, warehouse operations and logistics, inventory management, community relations, public policy development, and all the other broad aspects of food bank administration. So it benefits the young person who's trying to establish him or herself in pursuit of whatever career while they're volunteering, but they're getting this informal business administration kind of background as they're doing it.
Okay, I believe the next question is really important because in the planning sessions of this Kadamandiya Food Bank Volunteering Network, actually we detected this point because sometimes it's very hard to retain the contribution of volunteers for a longer period of time, especially during the periods like this COVID-19 pandemic situation. It's really hard. As a leader, which method you would like to practice to getting them back on track?
Yeah, it is difficult, especially when you're in a difficult economic circumstance like that which is caused by a lockdown, right? So businesses are stopping, people's personal issues become much more important because of the interruption of their economic support base and that sort of thing. In my opinion, one of the best ways to retain the interest and commitment of young volunteers is to give them real voice in the day-to-day activity of the food bank operation. Invite the volunteers to share their suggestions and concerns. Don't just, in some places, they have the tendency to view volunteers as the extra throwaway help. You know what I mean? That they're not the paid employees. They establish the rules and the regulations for how the organization will engage with the volunteers and the kinds of work that the volunteers can do, and they don't look at the volunteers as the critical resource that they are as unpaid employees, and I believe that it's vitally important to treat volunteers the same way you treat your paid employees. They're part of the family. They're part of the process of advancing the work of the food bank. So you need to create forums and opportunities, and you need to create an environment and an atmosphere where the volunteers feel secure in bringing up suggestions, just like an employee will bring up a suggestion. You know, after working for a few months, an employee will say, you know, I do this function and I think it could be more efficient if I did it this way, if we changed this policy or if we changed this process. You need to allow volunteers to have the same opportunity to offer their suggestions, and to raise their concerns about something that they see in the way things are done. And frequently express the gratitude of the food bank board and the staff for the contributions that the volunteers make to the organization, and be flexible in allowing the volunteers to shift from one role to another role as their own personal interest and education and skills level evolve. You know, recognize that just as you would with an employee, be open to allowing them to move within the organization so that their skills and their interests are best suited to the job that they're doing at the time.
Okay. Actually, COVID-19 pandemic situation, it's really hard time for all of us, I believe. So even in these Kadamandiya Food Bank activities, we are experiencing it, and now we are trying to face this situation. Actually, my next question is about this COVID-19 pandemic situation. As you have experienced within this 1.5 years of this COVID-19 crisis, what were the deviations from the the usual situation of the food banking services, and what would you predict in the future? What would be the changes that may occur in food banking services, and in case of volunteering, what will be the changes that may occur in the future?
It's we're actually in the midst of doing some research and study on that very topic. Trying to figure out, well, what new practices or what changes in practices at food banks have had to be made in response to the pandemic, and which of those changes in practices or which new practices are likely to extend beyond the pandemic and become part of the typical operational model of various food banks. As long as the pandemic continues to be affecting us as it is now, food banks are going to be really limited in their ability to gather staff or volunteers in groups to do the work, right? And you're experiencing this yourselves in Sri Lanka right now. The lockdown is essentially creating a lull, a pause in the food bank's ability to function. Things like even in food banks where they have gotten exceptions from lockdown restrictions and they're able to function, they still are having to deal with things like social distancing and the need for PPEs. Masks and gloves and all the other items that are necessary are making them have to reevaluate how they can deploy volunteers and their paid staff as well in order to continue to move the food bank's operations forward. There has to be a lot of careful consideration about how to ensure the health and the safety of the volunteers and of the staff. So this requires the food bank to seriously think about its processes. Excuse me. It requires the food bank to seriously think about its processes and policies, and requires that the food bank review its step-by-step procedures to identify potential points of exposure for the volunteers, and then redesign the activity to work around those points of exposure. I think that in the future, more food banks are going to be continuing to do more delivery of product to their beneficiaries, as opposed to having the beneficiary. I'm talking about the institutions, not the individuals, the institutions that receive the food from the food bank. Rather than having them come to the food bank to get the food, food banks are going to be doing a lot more delivery of that food, just trying to cut down on the logistics difficulties around bringing so many people into the facility at the same time. Issues like that, I think, are what are going to be facing the food banks over the course of the next couple of years.
Yes, exactly. It's really important to be with plans for the future. We cannot predict the situation. So last but not least, actually, as I mentioned previously, we are planning the volunteering program for the Kadamandiya Food Bank. In these days, actually, we have started it. So my next question is, in your point of view, what is your thought about Food for All Kadamandiya Food Bank?
I've said this before when in conversations that I've had with your team. The food bank started during the pandemic, and that is a really difficult time to start a business, right? And it's been very challenging for you all. In doing your planning and your the interviews and the meetings that you've had with various potential donors and support stakeholders, as well as the interviews and the surveys that you've done trying to identify those beneficiaries that would be receiving the food that the food bank is generating. Doing all of that in the context of the pandemic is very, very difficult, and I want to acknowledge and give a lot of credit to Team Kadamandiya for staying with it and for being as focused as you all have been. You're put in a position right now of being in a kind of a forced lull in food bank activity, and I think that you all are being very smart, taking advantage of this lull in activity to focus on building an educational program and developing a promotional campaign to build your volunteer base, and to do it outside of Kandy, and looking at opportunities to build a volunteer base in other parts of the country, so that as the food bank moves back into normal activity, you've got a stronger base in other locations to be able to pick up and quickly engage donors and provide support to beneficiaries in a broader geographic area than originally conceived. So I think that's a smart approach, and developing this podcast series to help with, excuse me, let me get some water. I think it's a very smart approach that you all are taking in building the promotional campaign to build that volunteer base while you're in this forced lull, so that you have a trained team ready to go when the restrictions start to recede as the pandemic situation begins to improve. So I really congratulate you all for your focus and your commitment, for your dedication to the community. I look forward to, and I pray for passage of the pandemic sooner than later, and for the ability to finally visit with the food bank and get to know it more deeply, and identify how we can be more helpful as you scale the operations.
Okay, so thank you very much. Actually, it's really challenging these times, but we will not give up for sure. Right. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of the second episode of the podcast series brought to you by Food for All Kadamandiya Food Bank under the theme of Ask from the Experts. And today our topic was volunteering and food banking services. And on behalf of all of you, I would like to thank Mr. Chris Rebstock, the Director Field Services of Global FoodBanking Network. Thank you very much, sir, for giving your precious time for the podcast series, episode number 2. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll meet you with the episode number 3 of the podcast series brought to you by Kadamandiya Food Bank. So till the episode number 3, stay safe.